I'm starting this story with a warning. There isn't going to be a jump scare moment. A moment where I find myself to face with a drooling monster munching on a disemboweled corpse. The only disemboweled corpse in there that I could have, but I didn't seen it, at least not in person. How to start? Well, there's only mainly one place. C.M. Morley's Compendium of Strange. It was surprisingly thick paper book. Pro's 9-year-old self had picked up the rummaging sale for 25 cents. The cover, which had fallen off of my copy now, yes, I still owned it, depicted a special lady, a floating eyeball and a giant bat, and promised hundreds of true tales of paranormal, which, to a certain extent, it delivered on the book. There was over 300 pages. Morley generally spent a page a tale, occasionally venturing into town, or even with free when he was feeling particularly prolix. The tales were joyously broad munch. Morley had covered ghosts, flying saucers, psychic phenomenon, and just plain odd things, all with the same cheery, slightly sinister, slightly goofy tone, which he achieved. I came in to realize that not taking any of it seriously, his comment made a female ghost who just picked up an overabundance of gothic touches when she materialized on a local rock be given a pillow to sit on, in addition to the candle and dagger dripping blood with some insisted she appeared, which still gives me a chuckle. As I learned later that the compendium was the promotion volume of C.M. Morley's full name, Clive Mansfield, and yes, the hence C.M. Strange Tales, more strange tales, and still more strange tales, themselves series of collections of newspaper column called Yes, Strange Tales, that Morley had written for years in the late 30s and early to mid 40s, in addition to half a dozen of other columns on another of half a dozen of subjects, including Pride and Joy advice on playing on the Action Bridge. Morley attended to bang his strange tales out of the hurry, doing a little way of research, and indeed, not frequently just making shit up with an adrenaline deadline was looming, and he couldn't find any other occurrences in the newspaper archives or in his vast collection of philosophic literature. Clive just liked to read that stuff, his widow tell me years later. 5 pages and he tossed that book down, laughing to himself. All of which a young boy who is certain that Bigfoot and Saucer Man are really real and possibly connected to each other, neither knows nor cares about, and so it was astonishing delight that I read about a strange occurrence in my hometown, which I will reprint here in full, save for the name of my hometown if this story takes off. I don't want people getting their mask for a wide variety of reasons, and the large drawing that helps fill out the page. Yes, the book is illustrated, and pretty well, I have to say. History repeats itself. In 1931, on a dreary November morn, inhabitants of W in Upper N woken to find a body of a young woman near the town's railroad tracks. A woman, everly beautiful young blonde, was unknown to any of the residents, and indeed all efforts to identify her failed. Eventually she was buried in the local potter's field under the name Jane Doe. The local investigation into her death peered out, and W residents shuddered to themselves for all that happened before. It was 23 years later, earlier in 1908, when another dreary November morn, they had woken up to find the corpse of a similarly young, beautiful blonde in the very same spot. The mysterious woman laid there in the same potter's field, and under the same potassium, as the attempts to identify her likewise had failed. How was that the same terrifying event that occurred in the same location over a distance of years? Who's to say? Needless to say, it was a delight to me. A discovery by that boring old hometown had something thrilling occurred to it. Something that had caught my interest of the great C.M. Morley, the compendium, turned me into a great admirer of the man, something that age and growing cinema, I might add, have not completely worn away. The story became something of fascination of mine, one I would break out at parties and family gatherings, causing my younger cousins to shriek in fear and just a bit of admiration. Well, time and tears went by, and I collected dust, for there are many things I didn't know, as I burst in degrees upon what I like to call the young manhood. I came to understand that much of what I believed as a child was, well, bullshit. That was the great Bigfoot Saucerman Alliance, was the creation of disturbed minds, people choosing to fool themselves, and sometimes people actively choosing to fool others. Martin Gardner became one of my favorite authors, and I became fond of nothing that people, while the odd things did happen, most of them weren't as odd as all that. But I still had a soft spot for my hometown's bit of weirdness, as reported by Morley, and so one day I decided to research it. In many ways I was fortunate. This was one of the rare cases where Morley had given a date, 2 dates actually, in a place, even if the true form he had neglected to give any idea of what his resources might be. In fact, I learned that he had one source, a blurb in 1931 New York Times on the subject, which Morley with his usual penchant had expanded gleefully on, and I was a hometown boy with ready access to our hometown paper, the W Herald, which is based over 100 years in print, and its archives in the office, and the town's massive Pizzuto classical library. I will not go into detail great on my research in the archives, the tale involving numerous incidents with that magical thing being called microfilm, which was one cutting edge of technology, most of what happened being largely interest only to myself. I will focus on what I found, which is after all the gist of my tale. To my relative surprise, it turned out to be yes. Morley's tale had happened, more or less. The mysterious body had appeared on November 15th, 1931, by the railroad tracks. It was a blonde woman, rather young, although there was no mention of any ethereal beauty. The articles were a great deal of breathless than Morley had mentioned rather coldly, something he had left out of the body and suffered horrible mutilations. What exactly was meant by all this kept carefully out of focus by the writers, who in their own matter-of-fact way were milking all this for what it's worth. A sketch of the young woman's face was included, in effort to identify her. Likewise, it did not suggest ethereal beauty. Efforts to identify the young woman failed. Efforts to figure out if she had been murdered, mauled by animals. The town was a bit of a backwater, and all these things happened, or simply suffered some sort of misadventure. Likewise failed, resulting in her burial. None under the name Jane Doe, I may add, and during all this, I found efforts to see if there was any connection to the previous incidents occurred. Yes, incidents when Morley and his NYT procedure had missed, and what was apparently happened twice before in 1908 and earlier in 1885. The Herald mentioned this, and he even had an interview with the old woman who lived near the tracks and could remember the previous 2 times. Although as she's been at 12 at that point, her memory of her first incident wasn't good. Reading the articles, I wasn't filled with any sense of ancestors, shuddering at the eerie incident. More sort of vague puzzlement. I wondered if these were unpleasant occurrences were connected to one another. And so I wound up checking further back. The 1908 articles weren't incredibly helpful, although it revealed that the body had turned up in September, not November, and included yet another sketch that suggested that Morley had ethereal beauty in the brain when he wrote this blurb. The 1885 articles would be interesting, as I quickly learned that W. Herald had been the W voice of truth back then, and its publisher, editor, and chief reporter had been one Fyodor Cornelius van Hatput, a generally insane man who made a small fortune in the Civil War. He had founded the Voice of Truth and shouted out his various insane theories into the world, and local happenings in W. Van Hatput's stories and the incident were bizarre rumbling feasts of paranoia, where he shouted at the inefficacy of the local authorities, claimed that the state was covering things up, and went on about how familiar incidents that happened in 1862. Both incidents were, he insisted, the same, virtually identified corpse in the same location, or what swore was the same month in October. Yes, Van Hatput was quite put out of the whole incident, was certain that the Freemasons, or maybe the Catholics, were behind it, being equal opportunity 19th century nut job. He went on about it for months, and then lost interest and started ranting on how the state governor was in bed with the Goldencrats to destroy free silver, one of his other obsessions. 8 years later, Van Hatput would lose his entire fortune during the stock market tumble, call his staff together one day afterwards, declare that the Jews and the Papists have gotten me at last. Now, to blow his own brains out in front of them, following which Sander heads would buy the one profitable possession he had left, the Voice of Truth, and turn it into less flamboyanty, named Herald. I have liked to go back further to study the 1862 incident that Van Put talked about, but only he has started the paper back in 1866. It was probably pretty much for the local coverage. I will add, though, I've managed to find a few bulbs on it on regional papers. They are so vague that I have no way of gauging the accuracy of what Van Hatput reported, which is quite important, because the man was about to be as crazy as you can get before people decide that you need to take a relaxing trip to a place with restraints. Still, my research had been surprisingly satisfying. I'd found out that not only was the mystery real, but when you got down to it, a touch weirder than morally you had realized. A similar incident recurring free had quite possibly 4 times over semi-regular interval. Yes, it had been quite interesting, and then I decided to play a hunch. I started checking the papers in 1954, stating in September. They found the body towards the end of that every month this time. The articles were terse and made no mention of the 1931 incident, much less the ones before that, although there was a sentence that could be interpreted as the oblique reference. This was the first time that the corpse was especially mentioned as being found nude, or prior to that. They preferred around the fact, and this time, instead of a sketch, there was an actual photograph of the unfortunate woman. The first one to generally occur the time named Jane Doe. It wasn't a remarkable face, actually a bit pretty, but not beautiful, nor even striking. The sort of face you forget after you've seen it. But on the whole, the story just didn't get the interest of the previous ones. Had the town-grown law enforcement was a lot more confident, their whole affair would be explained shortly, and the body identified. Everyone seemed to stress, and when that didn't happen, well, everyone just shrugged and started worrying about other things. And that was that. Yet another nameless body buried in the country. If you're guessing I moved on to check 1977 after this, you're damn right. I almost missed her this time, as the body turned up in September, the latest ever, but I pressed on, and there she was, a complete without another photo, and there was something that somehow didn't surprise me at all. The same woman who found 23 years earlier, and possibly 46 years earlier, and 69 years earlier, and 91 years earlier, the woman I was starting to call Lady Jane, in all her dishwater blonde, vaguely pretty glory. I was left wondering why no one had realized, indeed why no one had bothered to connect at least 77 and 54 incidents during that time. But now I'm older, and I think I know why. W had grown quite a bit, and acquired military base nearby, which made it did grow even more and added a delightful blend of racial and class tension into the area. Simply put, the bodies popping up were still in the news, but they were no longer automatically big news as a mysterious corpse that may or may not have been murdered, as no next to kin, and refuses to identify more a nuisance than a mystery for law enforcement. Of course, there was another theory that occurs to me, but it is the realm of Van Hupput, and thus I pay very little attention to it. At the risk of dating myself, as I mentioned, microfilm didn't do that already. I'll state that pretty much most of my research happened in the late 90s, so I was also contemplating this really bizarre occurrence. I realized that I was going to be on hand for what might be Lady Jane's next appearance. As the year 2000 rolled around, I waited and waited until early November. It happened again. I won't bore you with the details of the case, which was, when you get down to it, the same case as all previous occasions. The body was found. The woman was never identified. Nothing was ever found to explain, well, anything. I considered coming forward with my information, but ultimately decided against it. After all, knowing about the pattern that hadn't helped folks back in 1931, so I'd probably accomplish would be able to get myself branded a crank, and so Lady Jane made what seems to be her standard appearance before getting buried once again. I moved from the area a few years after that. I still have no explanation for what occurs in my hometown. At a strange, regular interval, occasionally I attempt one. Perhaps many of the family killers, very specific taste in their targets. I considered once, but at the end the absurdity of it always breaks it down. I don't know why, and I don't know how. I don't even know when it will end. No more than I already know it started. All I know is that Lady Jane will appear on the schedule, and that people will wonder for a while, and then they will get on with their lives, and she will get on what happens to be one of the horrifying protracted death. What's up, my pretties? It's the Lion Queen here. I want to appreciate you all for tuning into this video, and I do appreciate you guys supporting my video by giving this video likes and stuff. If you really enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like, comment and subscribe if you're new, ring the bell for notifications to when I upload so that way you guys will get updated for whenever I upload. If you want to follow me on Twitter or DeviantArt, feel free to leave a follow on those if you are interested in following me on those socials. If you want to support my backup channel, known as Miss Dark Shigo, feel free to subscribe to it, as a link to that will also be in the About page section. And with that being said, and that being the case, thank you so much for watching, my pretties, and as always, stay pretty.